All right, let's get started on 2 Samuel. We did 1 Samuel last week and began talking about the progress of the Old Testament survey, how we're looking at the books and trying to understand how they kind of fit in with each other and how the story progresses over time. We talked about the difference between that and like systematic theology, where you take a subject and you study that subject all through the Bible, or the difference with exposition or exegesis, where you take a passage like Frank has been doing through Ephesians and you really try to understand that passage. Here we're trying to really understand what's often called biblical theology, which is where you understand the progress of the story of the Bible as it goes through. We talked last week, and I'll talk here again in just a second, about how even though the Bible's made up of 66 books, it's really rather more like one book made up of 66 chapters, as it were. And I'll give some examples here of connections you see between Bible books, and we talked about it in 1 Samuel and how it related to Judges, and we're going to do that with 2 Samuel as well. As a reminder, we do things a little different in English than they do in the Hebrew Bible. So in English we have, after the Pentateuch, we have the historical books that we call them, so the history books, as it were, of which Samuel is one of those. In Hebrew, they actually, after the Torah or the Pentateuch, they have what are called the former prophets. They have the prophets, which are broken up into two, former and latter prophets, and Samuel is actually a part of the prophets. And that's important, we'll see, especially next week when we get to Kings, and we sort of finish the story of the prophets. We'll see why that's really important. But we have the same number of books between the Hebrew canon and our canon. We have the same books, different number. So they have 24 or 22 books, we have 39, and that's because oftentimes they'll combine books, like what we call the minor prophets, they call the 12, and it's one book. Or where we have 1 and 2 Samuel, they just have Samuel. And it's split primarily starting with the Greek version of the Old Testament, where they added vowels, and the length of it was too big for one scroll, and so they split it, 1 and 2 Samuel. In fact, in the Roman Catholic kind of version, I think this was true in the Greek version as well, the LXX, it was definitely true in the Vulgate, which is what the Roman Catholic Church still used for many years. It actually groups Samuel and Kings into one book called the Kingdoms, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Kingdom. So all this to say there's different orderings. I think it's important to understand how they were originally given, in which Samuel was one book and was found there in the former prophets. Okay, so we talked about how there's these connections between the books. I'm going to explain that here in just a bit as we get into 2 Samuel, and how it was one book, but we've split it, and yet there is still connections between it and what comes before. What I want to talk about today, I'm actually going to spend the first 20 minutes or so, not in 2 Samuel per se. I'm going to just try to take all of the story so far from Genesis to 2 Samuel and sort of put it in a framework that helps us to see those connections between the books. So we'll spend a little bit of time, the first half of the class, not even really focused on 2 Samuel. And the reason for that is, as we'll see, there's going to be a really big break between 1 and 2 Samuel. Despite the fact that it was originally one book, there's a significant break between it. And I would even say that the connections between 1 Samuel and Judges are stronger even than the connections between 1 and 2 Samuel. What I mean by that is there's a bigger break, it seems, between 1 and 2 Samuel than even between Judges and 1 Samuel. It's just strange because, again, we think of it as separate books, and I just argued that Samuel was one book. But again, the point here is that even the divisions, one book, God has authored one book. We'll see even here that 2 Samuel, the structure of it goes into 1 Kings. And so you have to look at the Bible that way. So there's going to be a very significant break between 1 and 2 Samuel.
Are those in chronological order currently?
Which ones?
All of them.
Everything here is in chronological, yeah. And so
Eventually when you go to other books, will they still be in chronological order, or do they get out of order eventually?
in like the Hebrew ordering?
Well, just the way you're going to talk about it, or the way it's going to be presented. I'm just wondering, because I know that they're not always in chronological order in our Bible.
Yeah, so both English and Hebrew, they're in chronological order to the point where we are right now. And in neither are they strictly chronological. But so far, from Genesis to 2 Samuel, it's all chronological.
Where does it stop being chronological?
So in English, it goes further to be chronological. It goes all the way to Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, right? And then that's when we get into things like Psalms, which still have Psalms of Moses and things like that. In the Hebrew, it's going to stop sooner. So you're going to go through Kings, which is going to go, and then you're going to go back to the prophets, the latter prophets, which are woven throughout that period. Some like Jonah were earlier, or Obadiah, and then some like Malachi were even later, and then you come back and pick up some of the other books in the writing. So they both are not chronological pretty soon after where we're at right now.
But
Chronicles is
currently they are.
a retelling of Kings, right?
Yes.
From a different perspective.
That's right. That's right. So even in the English Bible, Kings and Chronicles kind of covers the same period, whereas in the Hebrew Bible, as we'll talk about in just a second, Chronicles is the last book of the Hebrew Bible. It's a lot, and again, I'm going to teach Kings in one session. I'm going to teach Chronicles in one session. The only reason I split up Samuel, I actually don't have a ton to say about 2 Samuel. The main reason I split up Samuel is because of the 20-minute session I'm about to do here, where I try to put Samuel in the context of everything that's come before it. And I think it's important because it will help to explain Kings next week. And to do that, I have to make the point that there's a really big division between 1 and 2 Samuel, and I want to explain that here in just a second. And this is, you ask, okay, how do I know that? First, let me just remind us about the connection between Judges and 1 Samuel. Y'all will recall that the story of Samson and the story of Samuel, how similar those were, and then the stories of the appendix in Judges, and then the starting of Saul. Remember how similar those were, and how you could see that it's really 1 Samuel, the beginning of it, just carries that story of Judges. In fact, in my opinion, and what I taught last week, was the asking for a king was kind of the climax, or you could say the bottom of their kind of downward spiral. And then you remember God gave them grace and said, I'm going to forgive you, and it's okay. If your king obeys me, it's fine. You can have a king. And that's where we sort of ended. Now, at 2 Samuel, how do I know that there's a big break between that and 1 Samuel? And it's primarily because of these three words, these three Hebrew words, which just mean now it came about after the death of. That is a very uncommon Hebrew phrase that marks a very significant change in the story, or what I'll call a new volume or a new chapter, as it were. I don't know how to best describe it, because we talk about books of the Bible, but I'm trying to get us to think about the Bible as one book with different volumes in the story. It's almost like the Chronicles of Narnia or something like that is one story. Yes, they're separate books, but you have the same characters and you have a storyline going through all of it. This first word here, they don't have in Hebrew. They were just trying to stuff a lot of words on one sheet, right? I mean, they didn't have word processors that allowed us to bold and highlight things and organize things. So that word is what's called a macrosyntactical particle. It's macro means big, syntactical means it's like grammar, and so it's a word to divide a big section. And so we have it a little bit in English, like it's sort of like if you were to hear "once upon a time," right? You know something new is starting, or now it came about in the days of those kind of. It's that kind of sound where you know something new is happening, and that's what this word is. It's now it happened, or now it came about, and so we know something new is starting as a result of that. I mean, that doesn't happen just between, okay, now we're going to talk about a new king and it uses, no, it's a large break in a division. So I want to show you where it happens before, and again, this is not strictly about Samuel, but it helps put Samuel in context. I want to show you the 4 other places where it happens, where that same phrase, now it came about after the death of, happens. We have it in Genesis, after the death of Abraham. It's translated a little different, but it's the exact same Hebrew underneath it. It came about after the death of Abraham. It came about after the death of Moses. Now it came about after the death of Joshua. And then we have here, now it came about after the death of Saul. There's 2 others that are very similar, that are not exactly the same, but after the death of the sons of Aaron, and then later we'll see after the death of Ahab. So there's these 6 sort of dividing lines in this section of the Bible that sort of break it up into volumes, you could say. Now, what's the point of all this? Well, let's look at the first 4 at least, and just talk about what's happening in each of those 4. So, in the case of the death of Abraham, there was a significant covenant. I know we've already studied covenants. That's going to make this a lot easier that we studied that. There was a significant covenant that God had made with Abraham. And Abraham is passing off the scene, and this is a marker that there's going to be a new person carrying that on in Isaac. And then, of course, the story continues. We have that volume where eventually they end up in Egypt, and there's another very significant covenant made, with Moses at Mount Sinai. And then Moses is going to pass off the scene. You see, there's this really big change where now it's going to be the Mosaic covenant's going to be carried through Joshua. He's going to be the new leader, and a new kind of part of the story is starting. Then after that, Joshua takes the people in the land, and as you remember in the book of Judges, there wasn't a leader during those times. That was the point of the end of the book of Judges, right? There was no leader in those days. There was no king. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And Joshua's passing off the scene, and it's marking a significant change again where the covenant is being passed on, and it's to the people of Israel. So you see in each of these cases, not only does it have the death of the person with whom the significant work was being done before, but it talks about who the new person is that's going to carry on the next work. And in this case, it's the people of the Lord. And then finally, we have Saul, who is, if you remember Samuel, and we're going to read it here in just a bit, Samuel said, hey, you asked for a king, you did wickedly, that's okay. I'm still going to bless you. I'm still going to be your God. You're still going to be my people. And here's your king, Saul. Saul's carrying on that covenant, but now Saul's going to die, and it's going to be passed on to David, and David's going to carry on the story. Now that's sort of really high level. Now I actually want to show you, this is going into detail. I have just another 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll get into 2 Samuel. This is going into the detail, not just of these 4, but the other 2 I mentioned before, of each of the stories. And what I want to show us is that in each case there's a very similar pattern that comes through the story. Okay, so we're gonna go. Let me just go back so that I'm clear what I'm doing. I'm going to take each of these 6 big breaks in the narrative, and I'm going to look at the stories of each one. Okay, we'll see they're all around covenants, and they all have very similar stories. So we'll start with there was a Noahic covenant. I didn't mention that was the first covenant that was made, was with Noah after he came off the ark. So from this section before the death of Abraham, what was the storyline? Okay, we all kind of can remember it, but let me frame it in a way that shows you it's similar to the others. So first there was a promise. That was the covenant. There was the Noahic covenant. I promise I won't wipe out the earth. But right after that, there was a failure of the people. Because remember, part of the Noahic covenant was spread out. Go, be fruitful, multiply, populate the earth. And they failed to do it. And so God rightly could have wiped out those folks. They were disobedient. But instead of doing that, God said, you know what? I could have wiped out the earth, but that was the point of the Noahic covenant. I'm not going to do it again. So instead, I'm going to select a person with whom I'm going to, as it were, renew that covenant. I'm going to work on behalf of humanity through Abraham. And he selects Abraham and makes a covenant with him. And I don't know if you remember in the class, Frank talked about how sometimes when you make a covenant, there's a story at the beginning where God tells the people all that he's done in bringing them out of nowhere to bless them as a sort of a motivation for obeying and listening. So he says to Abraham, I brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees. I made this covenant with you. Often when these covenants are made, God comes down in a very visible way. And you remember he did that. We call those theophanies. It's theos, which is the Greek word for God, and phoneo, which is the Greek word for manifest or be visible. So it's God coming down. And remember, he came down in a smoking oven and a flaming torch. There was this vision Abraham had. And God gives a warning as part of that covenant that if you don't circumcise your children, if you don't obey, then you'll be cut off. All right. Then, as his covenant's made with Abraham, Abraham is getting old and nothing's happening. So as part of the covenant, a big part of the covenant was seed, was a child. And Abraham's nothing's happening. He's waiting for the fulfillment of that covenant. And what does Abraham do while he's waiting?
Doesn't listen. Or he doesn't.
What does he do?
He tries
he tries to do it himself, right? He gets Hagar, and so I'm going to call it impatience, and he sort of fails there. And then God still, he's going to take what Abraham did. It was not the right thing, but he's going to still bless Abraham. He said, no, I'm going to give you a child my way. And that's where you'll see in each of these, there's like a second exposition of the covenant. So in Genesis 15 and 17, he says to Abraham, there's going to be this covenant I'm giving to you, this Abrahamic covenant, even after the impatience and the failure of the new person that's leading that covenant. And then ultimately, we see the story begin to be fulfilled. That new covenant begins to be fulfilled through the birth of Isaac. And then we get that phrase, now it came about after the death of Abraham. And that's kind of the end of chapter 1, let's say. Okay? So now we're under the Abrahamic covenant. Isaac is the heir that's going to carry it on. And we're going to see the same story. We're going to see the same story unfold. We have the promise, in this case is the Abrahamic covenant. Okay, and yet there's this failure, right? So they're going to be the nation to bless the earth, and yet they sell their own into slavery in Egypt. They're going to inherit the land, and yet now there's this famine, and they're down not even in the land at all. They're down in Egypt. So what happens? Well, God's still going to care for them. In fact, he knew that was going to happen, but he's still going to care for them. He's going to, with a mighty hand, bring them out of Egypt. And he's going to renew his covenant now with the nation of Israel on Mount Sinai. Again, there's a massive theophany where God comes down on the mountain. It's smoking. There's earthquakes. And he's concerned, though, that the people are not going to be able to obey. He's a holy God. So what happens? Who was waiting in this story? He's up on the mountain. The people, what were they waiting for? Moses to come down, right? And so what did they do while they were waiting? They take things in their own hand. They made what? They made their own God. We're going to go back to Egypt, right? And that's what happens. And God still, despite wanting to wipe them off the face of the earth, and rightly so, Moses intercedes, and there's going to be he's going to continue with the people. Moses intercedes. God says he won't wipe them off the face of the earth, and the tabernacle begins to be built. Okay, and then what happens? The sons of Aaron die, right? After the death of the two sons of the Aaron. So now that sort of period is done, and now the next chapter is going to march on. We're going to take this Mosaic covenant and we're going to go to the promised land, right? That's the plan. All right? The problem is we have failure again. The people refuse to go into the promised land. So again, God's angry with them. What's he going to do? So he's going to renew the covenant. And that's what Deuteronomy is all about. It's the word deuteros is second. The word nomos is law. It's a renewal of the Mosaic covenant that he makes with the people. There's a theophany where God appears in the tent again. And there's concern that Israel won't obey. And then they're having to wait for 40 years in the wilderness. They're having to wait because they failed to do what they were supposed to. And while they're in the wilderness, waiting, Moses grows impatient, right? With the people. He strikes the rock. So Moses is told he can't go in, but we know that everything's going to be okay. God's going to care for them. He's going to allow them to go into the land. Just Moses isn't going to be able to. So we begin to take some of the land east of the Jordan, and that's when Moses dies. And it comes about after the death of Moses. So now we're working under the Deuteronomic covenant that God made with them. All right, there's the promise. Okay, so they're supposed to go in. What did the Deuteronomic covenant say? Go into the land. We're going to want you to destroy everybody. Don't make any covenants with anybody. Don't take anything. And so after they defeat Jericho, what happens?
They fail.
What did they do? Yeah, Achan keeps the stuff, right? So herem is the Hebrew word that means, destruction. They don't do that. And so they lose at Ai. So this is where it gets a little interesting. When we did Frank's covenant class, we didn't call out, because it's not one of the major covenants, but Joshua actually, as a part of that, after they go into the land and they failed, God doesn't destroy the people. Achan and his family are killed, but God continues with the people. They stand on Mount Ebal, I don't remember the other mountain, and they renew the covenant. And even at the end, I mentioned how there's often, after the failure, there's often a repetition of the covenant. We have that at the end. When Joshua stands before the people, he says, hey, as for me and my house, will serve the Lord. And he makes a covenant with the people in that day as well. So there's this covenant that Joshua is going to pass on to the people. Again, there's a waiting. Okay, so they've made it in. Now the opponents are assembling. And who comes? The Gibeonites, right? And they don't inquire of God. They don't ask. They just make this rash decision, and they fail. And so now that's the beginning of people being in the land with them. And that's just the start of them not doing what God said and making it a clean defeat of all the people, so they don't have anyone to be thorns in their sides. Nevertheless, they begin to take the land, and as we talked about when we studied Joshua, they take massive, large cities, but there's still a lot to be done. So fulfillment has begun. Joshua renews the covenant with the people, and then Joshua dies. All right, so now we're working under what I'll call Joshua's covenant. Right? So it's the one renewed by Joshua. And then there's just tremendous amounts of failure, to the point where they ask for a king to be like all the other nations. But all the way through Judges, there's all that failure. And that's when, now we're getting back to the what we're studying today, that's when Samuel renews the covenant with them. Samuel says, despite what you've done in rejecting me, because that's what God said, you've rejected me, despite that, I'm still going to be your people. I'm going to give you a king, and as long as your king obeys, all will be well. And we didn't read this last week, but God comes down and let me read it now just to give us 1 Samuel 12:16. God comes down and thunders again as he's telling them now. He says, even now take your stand and see this great thing which Yahweh will do before your eyes. Is it not the wheat harvest today? I will call to Yahweh that he may send thunder and rain, and you will see that your wickedness is great which you have done in the sight of Yahweh by asking for yourselves a king. And again, there's this concern that the king won't do what's right, and it's going to lead to their destruction. And then we had this story where there's also this period of waiting where Saul is told to wait 7 days for Samuel to come. And so what does Saul do? He doesn't wait, right? He makes the sacrifice himself, which again, God rejects Saul, but he's not going to turn aside his people Israel. And so he's going to do that through David, which is what we talked about before. So there's this fulfillment. Begin. David's anointed. We know he's going to be the new king, but then there's this whole period of him running away from Saul, which we'll talk about here in just a second. And here's where we get to 2 Samuel. Now it comes about after the death of Saul. All right, so that's summarizing a lot in a very short period of time. But here we're working under this kind of covenant where Samuel made with the people on behalf of God, that they'll have a king, but as long as the king does what's right, God will bless them, and they'll be his people. We expect there to be some kind of failure, and there is. Again, Saul is chasing after them. The king's not reigning. Even after Saul dies, which is where we're at now, the people won't let David be king. They take Ishbosheth and make him king. Ishbosheth means man of shame. He's a guy who's not even living in Israel. He's on the east side of the Jordan because he can't defeat the Philistines. And so we don't have what we're expecting. So what's God going to do? What did he do in every other case? He made a covenant. What covenant is he going to make? The Davidic covenant. So he's going to make a covenant, right? He's going to make a covenant with David, have all the indication, or many of the indications as we did before, like the historical prologue where he says, David, I took you from being a shepherd out in the fields, and I brought you in to be king, and now I'm making this covenant with you. But know that if your sons disobey me, I'm going to discipline them. And so I put up there the 1 Kings because, again, we expect there to be failure, and then we expect God to continue the covenant with someone else. That's what we're going to see in 1 Kings. But we're not there yet, so I just put question. So what's the waiting? David's waiting at home while his army's out, right? And what does he do? Yeah, impatience is probably not the right word. I don't know how, but he's idle, and he's not out with his army, and they're taking the city, and David's back at home, and instead of he sees this woman and he takes her. Okay, so and that's going to result in God disciplining David, and yet right after that there's going to be a statement of the birth of Solomon, and so we're going to know that begins to tell the reader, okay, Solomon is going to be the one through whom this fulfillment begins since David failed.
Isn't he impatient till waiting till the man died by
That'd be one way. That would be one way to say it.
instead of.
It seems like discipline might be another one that occurs regularly in this cycle. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. And this is not fully fleshed out,
Yeah.
but it helps at least. So this is probably only 80% accurate, and there'll probably be better ways to even say a lot of it. But it at least gives you a feel, which is all I'm mainly concerned with, is to give you a flavor for how there's this story that's recurring through, and it's going to be really important next week. Even though this week it's going to be like, why did we go to all this trouble? Well, I just needed to be able to say it, and the next week you'll see in Kings why this is really important. So, and that's when, well, actually we'll get to it in Kings. So that's where we're at. That's, again, this is the best time as any to do this. It's a lot of work to explain that, but it's going to be important next week. So now we want to get back to 2 Samuel and talk about just briefly another 10, 15 minutes about specifics around 2 Samuel. So we'll start with the structure of 2 Samuel. As it begins, as I mentioned, David is not reigning as king. Judah reaches out to him and wants him to start being king, but not the rest of Israel. So the first 4 chapters are David's kind of rise to becoming king over all of Israel. And then once he does, Abner is a part of that in trying to get him. If you'll recall, Ishbosheth makes an accusation of Abner about a woman. If I remember, it was one of Saul's concubines, and that causes Abner to go over to David, and that begins David becoming the king of all Israel. Once he does become king of all Israel, that's where we have 2 Samuel 5-9, and that's a description of David's rule, and it includes a lot of his victories, as well as that 2 Samuel 7 where the covenant is made with him by God. And then we have the failure of David in 10-12, which I call it his abuse of power. And then after that, David's fall from power. Just as precipitous as his rise was once Saul died, now he falls. And in the same way that 1 Samuel ended with him running away from Saul, 2 Samuel ends with him running away from his own son. And then finally, 2 Samuel 21-24 is the end of David's reign, which actually ends in 1 Kings 2, which is what I was referring to earlier, where you'll see structure that overlaps books. It doesn't end neatly where we have our book divisions. Okay, I just call this out as, if you remember the prayer of Hannah at the beginning of 1 Samuel when she was celebrating. It's very similar to the prayer of Mary that we read this morning, but when she was celebrating what God had done through the birth of Samuel and what God had done for her, it's very similar to a prayer at the very end of 2 Samuel where David is praying. David recognizes that he hasn't brought in the eternal kingdom that has been promised, and even though he's brought in fabulous reign of Israel, he's brought in the eternal kingdom. So David knows his death is impending, and he's looking forward in the same way that Hannah did. He's looking forward to what God is going to do, and you just see a lot of connections between what Hannah prayed and what David prayed at the end of his reign. As we talked about 1 Samuel, and we talked about how there were 3 key chapters, and similarly I have that in 2 Samuel. The key chapters are really the Davidic covenant, and then his sin and the consequences of that and how that changed everything, and then finally David's prayer when he recognizes that he is one of a long line of people who have been covenanted with by God but have failed. And David's hope of a future person coming, which everybody at that time would have thought was Solomon. Everybody would have expected Solomon to be the one that was going to bring the kingdom in, as it were. So when we talked about the purpose statement of 1 Samuel, we talked about how we used those key chapters to make the purpose statement, and we'll do that here as well in 2 Samuel. So you think about, it's about God's covenant. If you had to pick one thing that 2 Samuel is about, that's what it's about. It's David's covenant. We'll see next week in Kings, it's the last covenant. We already saw that in the covenant class. It's the one that everybody, when they're praying to God during this period of God not acting on behalf of Israel, sort of that intertestamental period, and God, there's not a prophet there. They're all looking back to the Davidic covenant saying, God, you covenanted with us. How long before you act? Because it's the last covenant we're going to see before the new covenant comes. So God's covenant provides hope for Israel that in spite of David's failure, that's the other key chapter, the blessings of a Davidic king will one day forever be a reality for Israel. Okay, major themes. We mentioned the Davidic covenant is the major theme. God renews the covenant. He's going to work it through Solomon, but he makes this covenant with David and all his house. The glory of Israel and her king. So I mentioned several of those covenants, like even Joshua's covenant, which we don't talk about as a covenant, so it's a minor change. This is a massive change. This is where, a really large interaction of God with the people, where he comes in, he creates this Davidic covenant, and he makes David this great ruler who brings glory to Israel. We're going to see 2 Samuel is missing a lot of it doesn't have Babylon, it doesn't have Assyria, it doesn't have a lot about the Philistines, and that's because all those major nations weren't the major player during those days. Who was the major player during those days? Israel himself was the major player. So God has really intervened, and we'll see with Solomon. Solomon is a great picture of what the millennial kingdom is going to be like under Jesus. It didn't last because of his failure, and it won't be as glorious, but it was Israel was people were coming from far off to come see its glory. It was the glorious nation. And God started that, and that's, again, why people look back later at the Davidic covenant and say, God, we want to go back to that. It's really not a bad thing that the first century Jews wanted. They just didn't want it with the righteousness that came with it. It was a good thing for them to want the kingdom. It just was a bad thing to want the kingdom with their sin. Again, the glory of Israel is prophesied by Hannah. It was something that David looked forward to. The ark and the temple is a big theme in 2 Samuel. In particular, the ark being in Jerusalem. It was in Shiloh before. It wasn't where its final resting place was going to be, and that was a big part of what David did as he came to power. Even when David was fleeing, if you think, when he was fleeing from his son, they were going to take the ark with him, and David didn't want it to go. He said, no, leave the ark in Jerusalem. He knew that was the place where God wanted it to be. Even as you think about the census that David took, which we'll talk about at the very end as an interpretive issue, when there was God's angel was coming and bringing destruction, and you recall that David saw the angel with his hand raised, kind of reminiscent of Abraham with his hand over Isaac, and the plague was averted. That was on the threshing floor of Araunah, which is where the temple was eventually built, which was also where Mount Moriah was, where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac. All that is about how important Jerusalem was to David, and having a place for God, which was part of the Deuteronomy, was having a home, a central home that all Israel could come and worship at. And Jerusalem was that place that David did. Major characters. David himself is the key character. A righteous king for the most part, but certainly a disobedient and repentant king as well. A very passionate king who would sing and dance, and a zealous worshiper of God, and his desire to bring the ark to Jerusalem. David's sons, Absalom is a key figure, whose name ironically means "my father is peace," given the warfare they had between the two, and then Solomon as well. Prophets begin to be a major theme. We've had Moses as a prophet, and he talked about a prophet that was going to come. But in 2 Samuel, we really begin to see really in 1 Samuel, we see the prophets. In 2 Samuel, it becomes even greater. We see them rebuking kings. We see them advising kings and revealing things to kings, and that becomes extremely important in the book of Kings. And this is where we begin to see the transition, as the prophets are going to pick up where the kings leave off. And the prophets are going to be the one that, in the latter prophets, after the former prophets, really set the tone for what's going to happen in Israel to come. Who's missing? I mentioned all of these major powers are not prominent in this book because Israel is the prominent nation during this time. Major places, Tyre and Damascus, we begin to get introduced to them. And that again will grow in the book of Kings as more major cities north and east of Israel become more prominent. But the major place is definitely Jerusalem, as I mentioned. I've just put up some thoughts around Jerusalem. Let's see how far they go. But Jerusalem plays a part in the Old Testament up to this point through Melchizedek and other places in Joshua and Judges where it's mentioned. But it becomes extremely important here, and you can see that how you have a few references up to this point, but then it's throughout, and it's going to become extremely important from that point on. I've got some pictures of Jerusalem just to share with people a little bit about where it's at, and kind of you'll remember the story in 2 Samuel about how Jerusalem is taken because the Jebusites didn't believe they could be defeated. They thought they were impregnable, and they kind of mocked David and said that even our kind of lame and blind people could defend you. And the reason they did that is because this right here, it's kind of hard to tell, but it's a little bit of a peninsula. It looks almost like Florida right here. There's a massive valley here that comes down where that spring is, and then there's a valley, a smaller, but a valley here on this side as well. And so really the only way, this is the new city of Jerusalem, so don't pretend it's not there. That temple was not built until Solomon, and this was not there. This was the main city of David, the main part of Jerusalem. And so the only way to attack it was from up north. And so it was a very defensible location. But that's where, if you remember the story, Joab found a way through a water shaft to get to the city in a different way, and was able to come and infiltrate the city and defeat them. That water shaft is the same one that we'll read about in Kings, or is the same area that we'll read about in Kings that Hezekiah, there's a picture of that area in Israel, but it's Hezekiah later dug that out and connected the water source outside to inside the city so that when they were going to be sieged by Assyria, they would have a water supply. And there's a picture of that tunnel that they actually started cutting on both ends and connected in the middle, which was a pretty amazing feat. But just quickly on the time period, we talked about how we'll talk next week how we know that Solomon reigned in 970 BC. So that means with David reigning with 40 years, the book of 2 Samuel was approximately 1010 to 970, because it's going to end with his death at the very beginning of 1 Kings. And then just quickly, just one interpretive issue this week, but in 2 Samuel it talks about how God was angry with Israel, and his anger was burning against Israel, and it incited David to go and number the people, which was something that was commissioned by God in the book of Numbers, but in this case was something God was displeased in. And the best I understand that, God did not want them to trust in their own power. He wanted, even the king to be a righteous king who relied on the Lord. And this was an act of David, maybe in their glory, trying to show just kind of how great they were. In Chronicles, we'll read that the chronicler, the author of Chronicles, said Satan stood up against Israel and moved David to number Israel. And so the question is that a contradiction, or why does the author of Samuel say that God in his anger incited them to do it, or his anger incited them to do it? And why does Chronicles say that Satan moved David to? I've got a quote I'm gonna put up there, but I'm actually gonna the best way for me, as y'all read that, the best way for me to explain it is when you think about, do y'all remember the story of Micaiah later in Kings? He was a prophet. There were two kings. There was a king of Judah and king of Israel, and the king of Judah was going to go in league with the king of Israel, and they were going to go fight against the king of Israel's enemies. And the king of Judah said, well, before we go, I sure would like to hear a word from the Lord about whether we should go or not. And he said, yeah, the king of Israel, I got lots of prophets around here. We can ask any of them. And they're all, saying, yeah, go do it. And the king of Judah says, well, they're all favorable because they're just lying. Is there not a real prophet of the Lord around? And the king of Israel says, well, there's one, Micaiah, but I hate him because he doesn't ever say anything good. And so they said, well, let's call him. So Micaiah comes, and he kind of tongue-in-cheek, says, yeah, go do it, you'll be fine. And they know he's not telling the truth. And so they said, no, really, what should we do? And he said, well, you're going to go, but you're going to be defeated. And he said, see, King Ahasuerus says, see, I know he wouldn't say anything good about me. He never does. And then Micaiah says, I saw this vision where God was saying, hey, how will I get Israel to go to their defeat, essentially? And one stands up and says, I'll go, I'll do it, I'll lead them to defeat. And he says, how will you do it? He said, well, I'll go be a lying spirit in the mouth of the prophets to make them encourage the king to go. And to me, this is very similar to that, where God was angry with them for good reason, I'm sure. And Satan was a willing tool to go and prompt David to do that, in the same way that he did with Job. Satan was a willing tool to do that. So to me, I don't see a discrepancy between the two statements, that God was angry with Israel, and there was, in his anger, he was going to incite them to do that, and Satan was the tool with which that happened. And that's a little bit what that verse says.